In this video, we'll review together some of the major elements in traditional method section and in-red articles, and look at some of the rhetorical moves that most writers tend to make in this section, and what they try to accomplish with that, and in general what a method section is supposed to accomplish. Other terms for method section you might find is materials and methods, methods and materials, as well as methodology, although methodology is often used in probably more theoretical pieces, and some of the humanities and social sciences tend to use that more frequently than the term methods. So method section provides a clear overview of what you and your research team did to get your results, right? That's what it does. It's supposed to be replicable so that other scientists can theoretically replicate your study and come up with similar, if not the same results. And this can be a little bit of a balance act in terms of managing the word count, because you want to make sure that you include enough information that others can replicate it, but also that you don't give unnecessary details, right? And this is something that can be tricky, especially for beginning writers in STEM fields, to make sure you don't write too much, but also enough. The method section really needs to organize the information for your reader, and there's a few ways you can do that. Some rhetorical moves, so to speak, that they can use. Dividing your section into subheadings is a really good idea, particularly for methods. It's very dense prose, very dense writing, lots of jargon. I'll talk about this in a minute. But dividing the subheadings helps organize it for your reader. And I'll show you two different examples how you can organize subheadings on two different articles. When you're using when you use a method that somebody else has used and cited and developed, don't reinvent the wheel and describe the whole method again. Just refer to that particular publication. So no great detail necessary for that. And when you can, use a flow diagram or table. And a flow diagram, I'll show you an example of that as well. You have it in your handout if you have it in front of you from the drug safety article that we use a lot in these videos, that I use a lot in these videos. And the flow diagram is meant particularly to describe the flow of patients or participants in a fairly large study. And in this study on drug safety, I think it's over millions. It started off with over 1 million people, ended up with just shy of 500,000, 500,000. Lots of people, big study. So a flow diagram is useful for that, rather than having to describe how you selected people and how people kind of left the study or were excluded for whatever reason, and suddenly it's like 4 pages later and you haven't even gotten to the juicy part of your method section yet. Flow diagram can help you with that, to summarize those things, and you can refer to it within your writing, within your text. And I mentioned already jargon. So jargon is something that I'm, as you've heard me say over and over, I'm the biggest fan of, unless it's necessary, and there's different levels of jargon based on your audience. In the method section, however, you probably get away with the most jargon because, again, it's very dense, very specific. So don't feel like you have to write here in a way that everybody in the general public will be able to understand it. That is not the purpose of a method section. It is actually written for people in your field so they can replicate the study, right? But you still want to write it in a way that a lay person, myself, could sort of follow what you're doing. Passive voice is okay, and we'll look at two examples. One actually where almost no passive voice is used, if I remember correctly, and the other one where it's a pretty good mixture, so it doesn't feel everything is very passive. Because what happens to you, and you might remember this from 603 for those of you who have taken that as a prereq for this class, that too much passive voice can really disengage your reader, and that is never a good idea. Science is scientific writing, or whatever writing you're doing. So common areas to cover in a method section are materials, participants or subjects, experimental protocol, study design, measurements, dependent and independent variables. One thing I forgot here, statistical analysis. That's sometimes a heading as well. So these areas often can, these words, these terms here can sometimes become headings. They're very generic headings, and I'll show you an example of one that's fairly generic with some specificity, and another one that has a lot of specificity. Before we go there, I do want to point your attention to this wonderful table from Ainsley's article that you guys read for today. Who, what, when, where, how, and why, the ingredients in the recipe for successful method section. And the table gives us different questions to ask to make sure that we're addressing them in our method section, organized by who, what, when, where, how, and why. And the why is really focused on why did you select a certain method over another, particularly if there is maybe some contention you feel. Many of these sub-questions here listed in this table are might be discipline specific or context specific, and there might be others that he's not asking. He writes from a clinical chemistry background. Keep that in mind. I think it's a useful table and useful tool to have, and so I wanted to highlight it. It's hard to see here on the screen, most likely that's why you have it in front of you in the handout as well. You can always refer back to it in the actual article. This might be a handy list, just FYI, as you're writing your comparison of the two methods in the results section this week. This might not be a bad tool to use, just a little hint. So, subheadings, as I mentioned before. Two versions I want to show you. This is the more generic one, as I like to call it. This comes from PLS01, from a fairly recent study. And here you see the sample subheadings, 4 of them: study sites and experimental design, measurement and modeling of soil respiration rates, sampling of annual above ground, statistical analysis. So these two here mix specificity and general terms very successfully. The first and the last are pretty generic. So you can do both. But again, even these 4 headings already help your reader to kind of plow through that very dense method section. Here's the other example that's more specific, less generic. If you look at the headings, ethics mice, HSV2 infection, NK cell depletion, and so on and so on and so on. Very general at the end, data analysis. So also from PLS01, same journal, posted a little earlier. So these are some good examples of specific method section. This looks to me, and I can't remember from the study, a fairly large study because of the number of subheadings. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So you can have a small method section and still use subheadings. It's really the author's choice. If you don't use subheadings, it's not like your work won't get published, or it's not a good method section. Adding some subheadings can just help your reader, again, plow through that fairly dense material in that particular genre of the IMRAD format. When you're citing commonly used methods, I wanted to show you some examples how to do that. The first one comes from the article on research ethics that we looked at for the introduction section, so we'll see this come up a few times during our IMRAD sections. So here the author started with, we adapted a list of research misconduct practices from those used in several studies, by others, Martin and his colleagues. There was a study that actually was really in great detail referenced in the introduction section, if you might remember, of this article about research ethics having not been investigated in countries outside the Western Hemisphere. And then it goes into specifically, these authors conducted 6 focus groups, and this is what they came up with. And then these folks adapted a list of misbehaviors and constructed misconduct composites. And there's a table that provides more detail and that links the specific misbehaviors for each of these composites. So it gives you a lot of information about the theoretical and like a foundation of some of the parameters used in the study. So a good example of not necessarily a clear method, but using something that was used by somebody else and adapting it and really explaining to the reader why that's happening. And the second example here comes from the from a study also in PLS01. I wanted to show you the sentence. Very short, very sweet. We use the same standardized protocol for 1-HMR2D spectroscopic imaging, MRSI, as described in detail previously. There's a citation, end of story. That's all you need. It's something that's really widely and commonly used. No need for you to really, again, explain to the reader what it is. If they want, they could look it up. This is the flow diagram I mentioned to you earlier from the study in drug safety, the one with it started off with over 1 million people. It's hard to see here, so that's why I included it in your handouts. Hopefully you'll be able to have it in front of you and see it a little bit more clearly. But it started out with over 1 million people, and then patients were excluded, and they ended up with 473,483 patients, which we already know from the title, right? Because it says over 473,000, just shy of 500,000. And then it gives us an overview of how these folks were distributed to the different treatment groups and then sub-treatment groups as well, right? So very clear diagram. So when you're writing up how patients were excluded and ultimately included in your treatment groups, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this because you can refer to the diagram, which is figure 1, and use that and save some space. One common discussion that I hear a lot of writers and scientific writers talk about is what tense to use. And so in general, you will use the past tense almost all the time in your method section because you're describing something that you have completed, that you've done in the past. So here data were processed, splenocytes and lymph nodes were isolated. So past tense is the standard tense for the method section. Present tense is only used when you're describing how data are presented in the paper. So data are presented in the following way. So numerically, however you're presenting your data, or you're referring to a table or figure saying figure 2 shows something, because you would use the present tense for that as well. But the actual methods, what you've actually done and put together, is in the past tense. 2 last slides, I just want to show you some examples of what I've talked about earlier, passive, the mixture of passive and active voice. Again, in the method section, don't be hard on yourself and try to edit out every passive voice. It's not possible. Is it a good idea to cut out some of it? Sure. But if each sentence in your section, your method section will be we did, and then we did this, it's a little monotonous as well. So again, it's already pretty dense in terms of the material and the content. So make it as easy as possible for your reader, and switching back and forth between passive and active voice is good. But you also don't want to end up just having passive voice, because that can also be equally monotonous than saying we found. So here, if you look at the sentence, if you take a moment to look at this with me, the development of absorptive transfer techniques markedly promoted, that's active, so that's great. Which are biologically active compounds, also active in the subclause there. Our group was previously interested, also active. We found that, also active. So, or the principle is shown in, this is passive voice. So we have a total of 4 sentences, 1 passive. And also, as you might have noticed, present tense, because again it refers to a figure. So this is another great example of what I've just talked about in the previous slide. So 3 sentences, 1 passive, that's amazing. Even if there were 2 passive, heck, even if there were 3 passive, I'll take any active voice in the method section that I can get. Let's look at the other example a little bit longer. So reducing agent oxidation of proteins can influence, so that's great. So we want to count passive here and total sentences here. For the purpose of the detection selected file, its reduction may be advantageously used. That's actually the passive voice. Earlier was active. Sorry about that. So active here. But on the second sentence, we have passive here. Primarily, we're interested in the influence of its something. Excellent active voice. It was found that there's a passive there. And we're now in sentence 4. Sentence 5. The changes of the peak with variable were studied. There's another passive there. Signals of examined files quickly increased. Great, it's active. Maximum was reached. There's another passive. At the concentration of 1 million. But this is actually nice because you have a sentence here that's separated by a semicolon. So it's technically 1 sentence, although it's 2 full clauses. It could stand independently. You could put a period there. The first one is active. The second one is passive. It's actually kind of nice in terms of flow. Subsequent increasing of phosphine concentration led to, that's active, which was probably caused as another passive. Again, passive, active in 1 sentence, also kind of nice. Figure A shows, again, figure 2A, right? So present tense, that's active. The arising figure corresponds to the signal, it's also active. Also present tense because it refers to the figure. The changes in potential signals are shown, passive. The phosphine concentration higher led to the distinct, it's active. So I lost track of overall sentences. Let me do this again. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sentences, I think, maybe 11 if I missed one. And I think there's about 6 passive constructions. That's not bad, right? Half is awesome. A third active and 2/3 passive is still awesome. If it's only passive, I'm like, okay, come on. Like imagine all of these sentences were passive, it would read very differently. So the variation here is actually quite nice. And this is something that if you're writing, is hard to do as you're drafting. So this is something you want to pay attention to in the revision process when you're writing an article.